Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weep Union, and in this one we cover the developments within the Seversk section of the front line. There's been a lot of corrections in this regard because there's been a lot of confusing reports and misleading footage. Therefore, we have to clear up the situation and cover the latest developments in the Toretsk direction, where the Russians have made a massive advance, and then in the Kurakhove, Seledove direction and Vuhledar direction. Starting out in the Seversk section of the front line, the Russians do not have full control over Verkhnokamiensky, as the flag they planted at the edge of the settlement was planted by a drone. The Russian soldiers are not at the edge of the settlement, and the Ukrainians are still present within the settlement. Therefore, the geolocated footage was simply a flag that was raised by a drone, dropping it, so a PR maneuver. The Russians are, however, advancing on the flanks, both in the southern and northern flanks, as they attempt to expand their zone of control. The Ukrainians are withdrawing from some of their forward positions further back, as the Russians also managed to flank their positions in the direction of Ryorivka, which was expected to be taken by the Russians, as the Russians raised the flag in person within Ryorivka, but according to the reports, they actually left following that because the village is completely in ruins and there was no position to take up within it. Therefore, it is in the gray zone. Serebryanka is in a similar position where the majority of the buildings are destroyed, so the majority of the Ukrainian positions are along the fortified positions along the front line. Therefore, the Russian advances were not as large or significant as it first seemed, but there are several advancements across this Seversk section of the front line. There's also a correction in terms of the VMK. According to latest reports, the Ukrainians do still have control of it. The reports that the Russians gained control of it were inaccurate, and there was no geolocated footage. The reports were simply inaccurate. So there was a correction here in the Seversk section of the front line. Now that we see the current situation and it has been clarified, it also gives us a better opportunity to explain exactly how these sort of confusing reports come. And the answer is simple when you look at the defensive strategy of the Ukrainian forces in the area. It is something that is referred to as positional defense. The way this works is that there are some forward detachments. We can see this with the fortified positions the Ukrainians have spread out across the front line east of Seversk. These are forward positions where Ukrainian soldiers are present, awaiting Russian offensive operations. So these are firing positions, ATGMs, machine guns, anything else you can think of that can fire at opposing forces advancing towards you. That is what these positions are, and they are fortified positions. The Russians bombard these positions ahead of advancing towards them, which gives them a window of opportunity to advance towards these fortified positions and get close enough to fight with them on a much more even ground. At that point, there is additional fire support from the line of defense the Ukrainians have along Seversk. This is the main line of defense, and the second line beyond that of the forward positions. Then there is a third line, which is the rear positions of Seversk. The way the whole situation works together is that the forward positions are there to give an early warning for the main line of defense. These are just to slow down any Russian advance and to detect it beforehand. This means that any Russian advance towards none of these fortified positions would pretty much go unhindered, except by drones and artillery that will be hitting their positions. As soon as they reach their forward positions, then fighting will take place with the cover of artillery and drones, which are located mainly along the main line of defense, as well as direct fire from ATGMs, tanks, and other long-range equipment that can be used from the main line of defense. Then, the third line of defense, which is beyond that of Seversk, is not in action until the Russians break through the main line. Their objective at that point is to redirect their forces towards these positions where there are a lot of units in reserve beyond the fire of artillery who are then to rapidly respond to such a breakthrough of the line, such a breach of the line, to push back the Russians beyond the first line of defense or the main line of defense. And thereby we see there is the forward positions, main line, and rear positions, and all of them work together to prevent a breakthrough. And this is how the Ukrainians have defended this section of the front line so effectively over such a long period. It is because they are dug in and they are well prepared with the 3 sets of defensive lines that are necessary for the positional defense doctrine. Now, this might sound familiar to you, especially if you've been following this war since the Ukrainian summer offensive, because this is the exact same strategy the Russians were using, just on a larger scale. Anything ahead of the main line of defense, the line from Verbove towards Stuttgart-Balka, and the general Surovikin line, everything ahead of it are simply forward positions. These are just exactly as the positions east of Seversk, positions where Russian forces are simply mobile units that are there to detect the Ukrainian advances, pinpoint the accuracy of artillery and drones, and to give an early warning of potential Ukrainian advances. Then there's the main line of defense, which is to simply prevent a breakthrough. But if it is broken through, as the Ukrainians managed to cut through in the direction of Verbove, then the Russians will redirect forces to clash with these forces and prevent a breakthrough of the main line of defense. So we see it is the exact same thing. There are firing positions in the rear, there is the main line of defense, and then there is the forward positions doing some positional fighting, and then there is forces in the rear who are redirected to clash with any breaching forces. So the Ukrainians are doing the exact same strategy of defense as the Russians were doing in the Zaporizhia section of the front line, here in the Seversk section of the front line. This means whenever the Russians do any fighting here towards the positional locations of the Ukrainians in forward positions, then the Ukrainians will respond with heavy artillery and drone fire, but there will be no significant fighting outside of these fortified positions. This is why when the Russians were fighting over the trenches, that is where the main fight was taking place. The next fight will not take place within the settlement itself, but on the fortified positions outside of Vuhledar, which is so close to the main line of defense. There will be a lot of fire support, which is discouraging for the Russians, unless they actually plan to breach the main line of defense, after which you'll need to concentrate a large enough force. And to do so, they would need to heavily bombard all of these forward positions, and it will require a much larger operation. Therefore, I am skeptical of any Russian offenses directly towards Seversk, because we saw with the Ukrainian offensive, it is something that simply doesn't work, and there's not really much to gain with such an offensive. Instead, the forces should be redirected towards Vyman in the north, Sevier in the south, at the flanks of Seversk, and simply ignore this pocket deep within their lines in the direction of Lysychansk. However, I do believe that there is some merit to the Russians for this attack on Seversk, and that is simply to keep the Ukrainian forces there. Now there's the general lack of manpower among Ukrainian ranks. The Russians have an interest in simply spreading the front line out as much as possible, and if these offensive operations lets that happen, then that is the only objective they can gain through it, while they focus their forces on other sections of the front line, such as Toretsk, Vrhove, Selidove, Vuhledar, which there are the main advances of the Russians, such as this one, where they captured the remaining parts of the forest area east of Toretsk. They also managed to capture the majority of the micro-district south of Toretsk, advanced in the northern parts towards Krimske, and generally the Russians have consolidated their offensive operations, gaining full control over this road here connecting the southern and northern parts of the Toretsk battle, which allows the Russians to concentrate their forces to gain control of the remaining parts of the southern district of Toretsk, the quarries here to the southwest of Toretsk, the industrial zone, the apartment complex area, and generally to gain control over Toretsk, the Russians will now be focusing their full force here in the southern parts of the city as well as the central parts of it. We will see heavy fighting commencing in the Toretsk section as Russians are looking to gain control over the most well-fortified positions of the Ukrainians in the area. Further south here in the direction of the southern flank of Seledova, the Russians advance along the railway as is expected to hit the supply lines of Seledova from both the northern and southern flanks. The Russians now have fire control over both of the main roads, leaving only one singular road outside of Russian range for their units flanking the town of Seledova. So we see fighting on the flanks of Seledova, along Sokorine towards Novoselidivka, attempting to flank here near Kurivka and Vovchenka. Further south in the direction of Vuhledar, the Russians have managed to capture a few fields and the connection between the roads of the coal mine one, Vuhledar and Vuhledar, as the Russians move towards this area right here, which is potentially an outpost of the Ukrainians. The Russians will look to gain control over that to solidify control over the road between Vuhledar towards Bohuyavlenka, as we'll be continuing the fight towards the forward positions of the Ukrainians outside of the settlement. Unlike other sections of the front line, there's no main line of defense here by Bohuyavlenka, and this is why the main fighting is simply for the Russians to bombard the forward positions of the Ukrainians so heavily that they can storm those positions with combined arms warfare to then gain control over them one by one. However, this requires a lot of coordination. The Russians will first do some scouting with some drones, detecting Ukrainian units along the fortified positions, after which they will plan strikes on them according to what is necessary. If there's a company who needs some FAB bombs, if it's just a few squads, then it will mainly be artillery and FPV drones. If larger units, they will use a lot more in combination with each other, as they then under the cover of the fire suppressing the Ukrainian units in these defensive positions, the Russians will storm those positions and fight over them in an attempt to gain control of them. And this is the sort of operations we see here in the Vuhledar section of the front line. And that is everything for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.